Today on CityCast Chicago, Chicago's new Board of Education will meet later this week for the first time since Mayor Brandon Johnson handpicked his members. And the clock is ticking as this will be the last fully appointed board before school board elections begin next year. So, what makes this group different from their predecessors? And how much can we actually expect them to accomplish in just a year and a half? It's Monday, July 24th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Sarah Karp is an education reporter with WBEZ. Welcome back to CityCast.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Sarah, how different are Johnson's picks from, say, Lightfoot or Rahm Emanuel's, the people who came before him?
Sure. Well, they're very different than Rahm Emanuel's picks. Let's just put that out there. A lot of Rahm Emanuel picks were attorneys or bankers or people like that. Same with like Mayor Daley, who's, very far in the past, but, he tended to stick with business type people. He liked business type people. There was usually a principal or two on their boards, but that was the extent of like the education voice.
We've talked about that before, that previous mayors have taken this sort of corporate CEO language and vibe towards picking their head of schools and their board members. But the more recent mayors have shifted from that, it sounds like.
Right. And Lightfoot, actually, her board was much more, community activist people than previously. I mean, people have a lot of criticism of her, but you just have to, give some credit. I mean, Lightfoot sort of moved away from the banker attorneys. And now this group is much more, formerly on the streets, marching outside the Board of Education. Now they've come inside and they're sitting at the head table. So, so that's much different.
How much of a game changer is this new board?
Well, I do expect that they're going to push against some of the status quo in Chicago public schools. I mean, there's a way big difference between advocating for something and actually knowing that what you say and what you do is going to change somebody in some people's lives. So I'll give you an example. Many of the people on this board are not huge supporters of charter schools, right? Those are privately run public schools. Now, however, they're not going to come in and just be like, no more charter schools, because that wouldn't make sense. There's over 55,000 kids in Chicago public schools attend charter schools. So you're not going to just immediately tell them that your school is no longer.
Exactly.
That would go against everything that they ever said. But I think that some of I don't expect that they're going to add more charter schools. I think they're going to scrutinize charter schools. So I think that those things will be present. They're not going to rip the Band-Aid off, but I think that they'll definitely push in the direction they want the school district to go.
Mm-hmm. Is this sort of near complete overhaul normal for incoming mayors? Is this something you see with every administration?
Yes. I wasn't as 1,000% sure what Mayor Johnson would do because, we waited a little bit of time before he made the announcement. I mean, it was like a couple months went by, and a number of the Lightfoot people that were on the board now had just been put on the board like within the last year. So I wondered if he might keep some of those people. They weren't ideologically like totally different than he is, but I guess he said nope. He brought in, he only kept the one woman on the board who's, very, very much a progressive. So,
I mean, Vice President Elizabeth Todd Breland, who you're talking about, is the only carryover from Lightfoot's era. Why do you think Johnson is keeping her, and how does she fit in this new board?
Well, I have to say, she is the person who speaks up the most, who has voted no the most on things, based on her values. Now, I actually think one thing that's interesting is she was able to be a progressive and to say what she wanted to say and do what she wanted to do, knowing that even if she voted no, the thing was going to pass. Mm-hmm. So it would continue. For example, she always votes no on the contract with the police department that keeps Chicago public schools having police officers, school resource officers. However, now, if she votes no, she might also be joined by enough people that they'll
Right, that no
actually
might carry more over
right,
in
right,
this new board.
right, and it might have more consequences. Like it might mean that a school that really wants police officers will no longer get them, and that could be controversial. So I do think that there's going to be a little more, thought on her end about some of the things that she votes no on.
The new school board president is John Ann Shee, who spent the last few years leading the parent advocacy group Raise Your Hand before stepping down for this position. What else can you tell me about them and the other new school board members?
Sure. So John Ann, he was a teacher prior to becoming the executive director of Raise Your Hand for public education. And that's a group that was started, I think maybe 13, 14 years ago, by parents who were upset at proposals to increase class sizes during a budget crisis. And so since then, that group has really, done a lot advocating for parents. It's probably the most, sort of well-known parent advocacy group in Chicago. One of the people that I did not know prior to her becoming a Board of Education member, but who's an interesting choice. Her name is Tanya Woods, and she leads a legal aid clinic on the West Side. And last week, the board, for the first time, they had what they call an agenda meeting. So basically, they go through agenda items and they talk to CPS officials about why they want each of these items to be approved. And she asks a lot of very interesting questions about public safety, about criminal justice, how policies with the school district relate to them. So I think she's going to wind up to be a very interesting choice. I mean, she's a lawyer, so she's exacting and she's very, precise questions, but also, she has this lens of coming from a legal aid background. And that's one thing. I think that she's an interesting choice. There's one really interesting thing too. So Rudy Lozano was a member of the board. And he has a famous father, right? He's a junior, and who is a strong community activist and politician. And something that one of my colleagues pointed out is that he's run for various positions against like the establishment Democrats. And that actually, that kind of made sense to me, because I feel like Brandon Johnson really wants to move away from like the establishment Democratic, the Madigans and the Burks and the kind of like that ilk of Democrats in Chicago, and be sort of this new progressive voice, of the people. So I think that was also an interesting choice that, I was trying to figure out the logic, and I think that might have been behind that.
I mean, speaking of politics, this board is about to get a lot more political in the next couple of years. This is the last fully appointed board before it transitions to a partly elected one and expands from 7 to 21 members in January of 2025. How will the board function between now and 2025?
It's very interesting. One thing that they said was that they're really focused on creating structures that will make it easier for an elected school board to come in and to function well. Some of that is going to be putting money into creating space and offices for 21 board members, just that physical space, but also how much staff do you need to staff 21 board members? What other things do you need in place to make it function well? So I think that that's part of their task. And then, Mayor Johnson has 11 of the appointees, and then 10 will be elected in 2025. But he will have to decide if he's going to keep this group and then just add a few more, or if he's going to, go a whole different direction. So it's also kind of interesting, because they have a very short period of time to do anything. They don't have a long period of time that they're guaranteed to be sitting in those seats.
How does that work if you're a board member or a prospective board member? You don't know if the mayor will appoint you. So should you run? or maybe you have a leg up to know that you might get an appointment so you don't run? Like, what is the psychology behind that? What if a person loses an election, but the mayor appoints them? Like, how is, Sarah, this seems like a complicated process coming up now that I ask more and more questions.
No, we are going into uncharted territory. It is going to be a bit of insanity. And I have to say, like, I've been covering Chicago Public Schools since 2005. Actually, the year my baby who's going to college was born, I started covering Chicago Public Schools. And all that time we've been talking about elected school board. And at one point I'm like, I'm going to keep covering Chicago Public Schools until there's an elected school board. And now it's just a year away, so a year and a half away.
Don't leave me, Sarah. Don't leave.
I know. But I do think it's going to be, there's so many unanswered questions. I mean, there's just so many, there's these big questions like, how do we draw the maps? What kind of territories do people have? But there's a lot of little questions like the one you brought up is, how do you know if you're going to get appointed or if you should run? And the other thing that I think is an interesting question is, do you draw the map right now so that there's 10 elected, so there's 10, so the city's split into 10 regions and everybody gets to vote for at least one board member, knowing that in just 2 years, it's going to have to be split up again into 20 sections. And so I don't know. And then all the money questions, it's going to be interesting because I do really, really expect that, I talked about charters and how right now the mayor is not a very big proponent of charters. I expect that the charter community is looking at the elected school board and thinking that's
throw some money in that. You got to put your money in that.
That's where you get the footing.
Does this feel like a set of lame duck appointees? Or will they be able to make any big changes given how much they need to figure out?
I think that they're going to push the school district, but actually I don't think they're going to make any huge, gigantic changes because they kept talking about how we have a very short term. We have a very short time on the board. But the other thing that everybody has to face is that in about a year and a half, the federal COVID money that has really, really been keeping Chicago Public Schools afloat is going to run out. And we have Chicago Public Schools has no idea of really how they're going to fill lingering budget holes. They don't know. This budget, CPS CEO Pedro Martinez says that he was trying to stabilize the budget a little bit, so not grow it too much like he has been. But still, there's hundreds of millions of dollars of staff people, that are their salaries are being paid for with COVID relief money. When that is gone, what do you do? Do you lay them off? This board is going to really, really not like laying off hundreds of teachers. They are not going to like it. But they say that they want the state to chip in more money, and I want Santa Claus. I want to win the lottery.
I want this Powerball to hit, right?
That's right. I mean, I'm like, good luck with that. I mean, they probably have a little better chance of getting state money than I have to win the Powerball, but still, it's not guaranteed.
And you and I have talked, I don't know, close to a dozen times now about all of the other challenges that Chicago Public Schools face right now, from aging buildings, losing students, providing more wraparound services, and providing more resources in an equitable way across the city. What do we know about the board's priorities going into this very first meeting?
One of the big things that's going to be going throughout this entire year is the school system has already passed, the Board of Education already passed a new accountability policy that won't have like summative ratings, like a number or grade, but we'll have a whole bunch of indicators, and that's coming into place. And as that ramps up, there's a lot of different things that the school district is going to have to pass and discuss, contracts, because, it's one thing to say we want to rate, like, we want to look at different measures, but you have to figure out, okay, how are you going to rate those measures, and then figure out how to communicate that to the public in a way that we can understand, because it's very easy, like in some ways, to just understand a test score. But if you want to rely less on test scores, how do you reflect these other things that people want, like culture and climate and access to opportunities? How do you reflect that in a way that people can grasp and understand? I know on this coming board meeting, they're going to talk about an accountability policy for the detention centers, which also is a very, very interesting thing, because you don't want to say those schools should be left out of being accountable to students. But the population is very different than, your typical schools. So I think those type of discussions will be very interesting to listen to.
Sarah, moving forward, back to school is not too far along. What are you going to be paying close attention to with this board as we sort of figure out the details moving forward?
So the accountability policy, that's going to be one thing. The other thing is how they address the issue of school safety, because this board is very much against schools resembling anything like detention centers. I do not think that they like police. I don't even think, last week at the agenda meeting, they were talking about metal detectors and how useful those are. And maybe they're not as useful as people think they are. The teachers are going to expect, and the staff are going to expect a lot. They're going to be expecting a lot. And so, he's going to have to do a lot to sort of like say, this is not, we can't do it. We don't have the money. So I think all those things will be very interesting going into the next year. And then, student achievement is still a big issue post the pandemic. The CPS CEO Pedro Martinez has talked a lot about how they're seeing some good progress in literacy, but not as much in math. And, that's disturbing. I mean, we need our kids to know how to read, write, and do arithmetic, right? So that's the whole point of this,
It may be a futile question to ask you to maybe prospect out too far, because who knows what it'll look like down the road. But are you feeling optimistic about the future of the school board with everything that's in front of it?
I'm always optimistic. I was even optimistic when all things seemed to be going to pots. I think education, is always, you have to be optimistic when you cover education, that good things can happen. And I'm always rooting for Chicago. I'm always rooting for Chicago Public Schools. So let's hope it all goes well.
The newest iteration of Chicago's Board of Education began their term last week, and the first board meeting is this Wednesday. We'll have a link in the show notes on how you can access the meeting. I want to thank our wonderful guest, WBEZ education reporter and 10-time CityCast guest, Sarah Karp. Sarah, thank you as always.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Before I let you go, a little bit of news, y'all. Today's traffic is getting an extra bump as Vice President Kamala Harris is back in town for her second time this month. The VP will make multiple stops before attending a re-election /DNC fundraiser in the Gold Coast. City Hall is hosting a youth budget roundtable tomorrow at 5 o'clock at the Harold Washington Library in the Loop. All can attend, but only folks 13 to 24 years old can participate. Please don't miss your chance this week to enjoy a free dance concert in your neighborhood park. Tuesday at Houston Park in Kenwood, Wednesday at Galewood Park in Austin, and Friday at White Park and Rogers Park. That's a lot of parks. And some good news. It's Crosstown Classic Week as the Cubbies make their way to 35th Street to take on the Sox tomorrow and Wednesday night. Y'all already know who I'm with, but I want to know who you're rooting for. Let me know at 773-780-0246. Leave me a text or a voicemail. I'll be back bright and early tomorrow, but in the meantime, in between time, head over to our brand new website, chicago.citycast.fm, and subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago. I'm going to talk to y'all tomorrow. Peace.